Hello darlings, and welcome back to another episode of the series where we are ranking every shooter we can get our hands on from the 360 and PS3 era, of course bringing you another 3 games. It is a very packed episode this time, so let's just jump right into it with the first game, Fracture. But before we begin, I would like to remind you to please turn on notifications and subscribe, leave a like and a comment down below. It really helps with the algorithm since I am trying to kind of rebuild this channel in the wake of leaving Just Add Monsters. And also, if you appreciate this content, stay tuned for more. I have a documentary on Fear 3 that I'm working on right now, which I have interviewed several developers for. It's going to be a very big undertaking, and if you would like to help support that or my other work, including my video essays, please consider going to Ko-Fi or giving to my Patreon, which will also give you producer credits at the end of every video. And all of that out of the way, without further ado, let's get right into the action. When it comes to games I would pick up at GameStop or a rental store and then put down, deciding it would be better to play anything I already had instead of the game in front of me, Fracture reigns supreme. Everything about it screams a generic shooter, from the bald, gruff, Unreal Tournament reject protagonist to the generic enemies and weapon designs. But during my time with it, I found that Fracture is actually one of the more unique shooters to come out of its era. No, Fracture wasn't forgotten because it was like other games. It was forgotten for other reasons entirely that I'll get to soon. First off, I want to say that I love Fracture's premise. In the near future, climate change has caused untenable damage to US infrastructure, driving a wedge through society and starting a civil war between western and eastern states. While it initially sounds ripped from the headlines, don't worry, the 2007 kicks in, and turns out the conflict isn't really between Guidos and hipsters, but between military factions siding with either genetic engineering or biomechanical upgrades as the path to humanity's future. It's a really cool premise that immediately drew me in, and then the game did nothing with it. But before I get to that, let's dig into the actual gameplay. I want to say that I think in the grander scale of gaming memory, Fracture was done dirty. It's an interesting game that does a lot more to stand apart from its contemporaries than some other games that are remembered more fondly. But it stumbles in several key areas which landed as an overall middling product. Firstly, Fracture didn't control at all how I thought it would. I had envisioned either a Gears knockoff cover system or just a standard Call of Duty aim-down sights crouch mechanic setup, but it actually takes more influence from Halo. B's melee, clicking in the sticks aims down sights and crouches, and even the grenade is on the left trigger. It's fitting that Fracture takes influence from the early 360 era of Bungie's classic franchise, because like Halo, Fracture is all about giving players a variety of tools and variables to ensure no two combat encounters play the same. The big hook to gameplay here is terrain deformation, where Jet, the main character, can raise and lower sections of terrain at will to trap enemies, trigger environmental destruction, or create impromptu cover. It's a gameplay gimmick that could only ever have spawned from this era of shooters, where every developer and their mother was eager to push game physics to the limit. From the start, the system is a mixed bag, mostly because it's hard to create cover when you need it most, often resulting in a fumbling mix of raising and lowering whatever terrain you can find as you panic and just hope you don't die. Once you get a handle on it though, it can be a deadly weapon, allowing you to ambush groups of enemies that have the drop on you and literally transforming the battlefield around you to your whims. Of course, with a system as robust as this, there are a few other gameplay elements that can interact with it. You have 4 unique grenades which can raise and lower the terrain, as well as form platforms for crushing enemies or solving puzzles, and another grenade that causes a gravity vortex that just kills anything caught inside. God, it really does make you miss the days of every game having ragdoll effects. There are other moving pieces all over the battlefield too, including rocket launchers that deform terrain, exploding barrels, stray pieces of cover that will move and fall along with the terrain, and other traps players can trigger like rock slides. These varied elements can lead to some really impressive displays of the power of the early 360 era, but are unsurprisingly prone to tanking the frame rate. There's even a respectable variety of weapons that would make the team at Insomniac blush, with standouts including a 6-barreled grenade launcher that can detonate all rounds at the same time, an underground rocket launcher, and a grenade launcher that creates a gravity well to crush enemies against loose physical objects like rocks and debris. The weapon handling is reasonable, but I do want to call special attention to the sound design, which has an excellent and satisfying crunch to the gunplay that I wasn't expecting from any game of this era, honestly. So from here, Fracture sounds pretty bitchin', right? Well, the novelty wears off after a bit, unfortunately, and while the game admirably implements the terrain mechanics for puzzle solving and some light platforming here and there, After the first few hours, it just becomes a bit stale. You enter a new arena, find cover or make it, take pot shots at enemies, and move on. The weapon variety is overall solid, but you'll be relying on enemy drops for a large amount of gameplay, meaning the standard assault rifle and sniper rifles will be the flavor of the day. New enemy archetypes try to vary the experience as well, but the AI just isn't up to the task. While enemies do an okay job of flanking and dodging fire on regular terrain, their pathfinding abilities take a huge hit when the ground gets too messed up, leaving them sometimes wandering in circles to find cover, or more often than not simply remaining stationary, shooting at the player. In one-on-one confrontation, the AI will just barrel at the player, taking fire and dying before they even get to cover or another shooting position. Even the few enemy types that are meant to draw players out of cover and keep them on their toes have easily discernible patterns that can be counteracted by simply finding a corner to hide in and popping and shooting. The enemy designs overall do try to vary patterns and attacks, including some neat ideas like enemies that dig underground, but the same tactics can basically apply to all of them. I do really like the design of this hammerhead mutant guy though. Visually, the game also leaves very little impact, blending into a generic malaise after the opening levels. Part of this, I suspect, has to do with the need to constantly have open environments to take advantage of the terrain physics and mechanics, but even that concession aside, Fracture's art design blends in with pretty much every other generic sci-fi shooter of this era, from the main character's Unreal Tournament reject look to the greeble-infested industrial machinery dotting the landscape. The best-looking environment, a war-torn, snowy future Washington, D.C., only shows up in the last act, which is a shame because it brings some much-needed variety that's missing in the first two-thirds of the game. It's actually a really great level with more open-ended design and winding alleyways, making me wish there was another urban environment in between the first two acts. There are a few interesting set pieces like an assault on the Golden Gate Bridge and an ensuing fight against a giant robot, where, also like Halo, you need to jump aboard and fight inside like a scarab, but they are too far and few between to make up for the sheer glut of similar environments players will trudge through on their journey. Similarly, turret and vehicle sections are also sprinkled throughout, again including some very Halo-like controls, but there just isn't enough variety in these sections to make them interesting more than a few minutes at a time. It's a shame because Fracture is still fun to play moment to moment, and on paper should be great. It has plenty of gameplay variety, a number of unique systems and set pieces to ensure players don't get bored, and even doles out new abilities like double jumps and strength upgrades at a regular pace. But unlike something like Halo, Fracture doesn't ever push players to use the tools at their disposal in meaningful and new ways, and as a result turns what could have been a revolutionary concept into just another corridor shooter with a physics gimmick. Fracture is exactly the kind of game I think a sequel could have turned into a proper classic franchise. Imagine this gameplay with the tech of a PS4 or 5, with the movement abilities of something like Vanquish, with a deeper terrain system that allowed you to pop up waist-high cover at any time instead of fumbling in the dirt like a 5-year-old making their first Minecraft house. Oh, and at this point, it's honestly fitting I've totally forgotten to talk about the story. While the writing and delivery is unexpectedly solid, it's also thin and only serves as a series of brief, well-animated interstitials to get players from one encounter to the other. Again, with better world building, Fracture could have had another element that helped it stand out. Instead, it feels like a shadow of other franchises at the time. Fracture, for all its faults, is a better game than Bionicle Heroes, but not quite as good as Dark Sector. With the recently released Quake remaster from Night Dive Studios, which is excellent by the way, please go buy and support Boomer Shooters so we can get more remasters on consoles, I figured now would be as good a time as any to take a look at the most recent real Quake game. No, not Quake Champions, I mean 2005's Quake 4 on the Xbox 360. Released as a co-production of Raven Software and id Software in 2005, it shouldn't necessarily be surprising that Quake 4 runs on the same engine as Doom 3, but I was not expecting just how much Quake 4 just feels like a mod of Doom 3 at the beginning. There are a lot of similarities right off the bat, from the same UI font and a similar setup, to similar weapon variety, a nearly indiscernible art style, and a host of other commonalities like sound effects and voice actors. Enemies even dissolve just like in Doom 3. It's not a huge mark against the game, but it does give a bit of a been here done this feel. On the plus side, Quake 4 brings with it a lot of the Doom 3 engine's beautiful, harsh lighting and detailing, which lends a lot of atmosphere to some otherwise pretty meh environments at the start of the game. I don't know much about the lore of Quake, but from what I gather, this picks up after the gritty sci-fi story of Quake 2. You are part of a Space Marine battalion fighting the Strogg, a grisly race of cyborg weirdos. The game spends a lot of time, probably too much, telling its story through extended sequences of standing around and talking, or just waiting for team members to get done talking. The problem is that none of it is interesting. Maybe it's just a lack of prior investment into the Quake universe, but every character here feels like the same Colonial Marines knockoff archetypes you've seen in a video game 1,000 times before, except in this one of them is voiced by Peter Stormare for some reason, so that's kind of cool, I guess. When you're not engaging in extended sequences of watching basic 3D models desperately try to imitate some semblance of life, Quake 4 is a pretty solid shooter. Unsurprisingly, weapon handling is similar to Doom 3, though Quake 4's sound design gives the weapons a bit more punch. The weapon variety has a few standouts, including a nice shotgun and a neat grenade launcher, which are doled out at suitable intervals. The game has a host of other small issues, not the least of which being a dreadful save and checkpoint system. Like Doom 3, Quake 4 has sparse autosaves and allows for manual saving, which means that you had better be saving after every encounter on harder difficulties, or you can end up spending 20 plus minutes replaying encounters. It's not so bad if you can remember, but the sheer amount of time it takes to save the game, let alone the exorbitant load times when you die and have to load an old save, makes this antiquated system feel so much more annoying than it needs to be. Like, Halo 2 had been on the market for over a year at this point. This game came out the same year as Call of Duty 2. It's more acceptable for a game of the tone and pace of something like Doom 3, but Quake 4 plays a lot faster and looser with enemy design, damage, and encounters, so it just feels like it hampers the overall experience. Another pretty minor, though overall fairly impactful complaint is that the game has no way of changing difficulty mid-game. After trudging through several hours on the hardest difficulty available at the start, I wanted to change the pace a bit when I got screwed by the checkpoint system into replaying a very not fun 10-minute turret sequence. But to do that, you have to start the entire game over from the beginning. There is no chapter selection or option to change from the in-game menus, which is a glaring oversight even at the time. So, after the first few hours, I wasn't super high on Quake 4. It felt like an also-ran Doom 3 that played a little bit like a generic Halo knockoff. And it was, at least for those first few hours. You see, there's a very specific dividing line in the Quake 4 experience, and that's the Stroggification process. At some point in the story, your character is captured and turned partially into one of the cyborg monstrosities you've been fighting for hours. Your teammates rescue you before the process is complete, and you return to fighting as a hybrid monstrosity. While there are technically only a few minor changes to gameplay after this, you move faster, have a bit more health, and can now use Strogg health stations, another Doom 3 holdover, everything else about Quake 4 also falls into place as well. With an expanded weapon variety including railguns, rocket launchers, lightning guns, and more, it begins to feel more like a classic 90s shooter, aided by the faster movement. Oh, another important change is that now all the UI has changed, and the Strogg apparently exclusively see the world in leet speak. And I would expect no different from a gaggle of 2005 edgy boys who spend too much time on their computers. Additionally, the enemies grow in variety and focus too, throwing all kinds of weird baddies your way to keep you on your toes. It takes the formulaic and slow jaunt of the first part of the game and cranks it up to 11, and I'm comfortable saying that from this point on, Quake 4 whips ass. And then there's the change in art design. While Quake 4's opening hours are nearly indiscernible from Doom 3's grungy industrial red planet, once you get deep enough into Strogg territory, the game takes an approach all its own, fusing industrial machinery with organic matter in a variety of Cronenbergian monstrosities that are fun to gawk at and shoot in equal measure. It even noticeably changes its lighting color scheme to a nauseating mix of focusing more on orange and green that fits perfectly to highlight the gruesome experiments and mutilations surrounding you through this section. In fact, there are sections more horrifying and hellish in Quake 4 than Doom 3. It's all in the superficial details, but the grisly tableaus surrounding your journey conjure the same feelings of seeing the hanging bodies or faces stapled on headstones in the original Quake. Artistic expressions meant to evoke terror, confusion, and awe in equal measure. And it works. When Quake 4 hits its rhythm, it manages to feel more in line with its old-school counterparts than Doom 3 ever did because of details like this. Some problems do follow the game throughout. The myriad vehicle sections feel underdeveloped and, with unstable shooting and high damage, represent the most frustrating difficulty spikes in the game. The frame rate is always fluctuating, sometimes dipping into a slideshow in bigger and more busy fights, and there are still a few too many moments of just sitting and watching people talk for my tastes. But once Quake 4 gets going, it shot up the list, shifting from a generic sci-fi shooter to a mile-a-minute gory fragfest. I can honestly only recommend playing it on medium or easy though. With high damage, the janky save system, and some intolerable load times, the hardest difficulties just aren't worth the trouble. It's held back by a few things, so I can't quite reach the consistency or variety of Quantum of Solace, but Quake 4 is certainly near the head of the pack for the games we've looked at so far. Oh boy. Hour of Victory is yet another in a long line of Call of Duty clones released towards the tail end of the dying World War II game fad. You play in multiple campaigns between the African and European theaters, fighting tanks, AA guns, etc., etc. I guarantee you've seen this game before, even if you've never seen Hour of Victory. Hour of Victory does bring with it a new idea. Multiple playable characters, each with unique abilities that, ideally, would let you choose your approach to gameplay. You have a tough SAS member who can move heavy objects, deal more damage, and has more health. You have a Native American sniper who can rappel to high ledges and jump across rooftops. And you have a gangly weirdo covert ops agent whose special power is stabbing people. On paper, this makes for an interesting spin on the incredibly tired World War II shooter genre. I think the addition of stealth mechanics might conjure an idea similar to Machine Games' more recent Wolfenstein games, allowing players to choose their encounter approach to a level so that each playthrough is different. In execution, however, Hour of Victory does so little to utilize the character differences and abilities that the entire gameplay system is almost ignored outright. The primary abilities can determine how players get around the levels, but the levels themselves are so small and brief, there's no real difference in the end. You can use the climbing guy to climb over something and end up in the same place as if the strong guy had pushed something. There aren't any special areas, weapons, or objectives between the characters, meaning that the primary difference between them is their starting loadouts and health. Now, you might have noticed that I haven't used any character names, and that's because even though I am literally watching the game's credits roll as I write this, I cannot for the life of me remember any of their names. I thought Soldier of Fortune barely had a story, but at least that game had an identifiable beginning, middle, and end. Hour of Victory opens with some cutscene naming the main characters as part of some special unit, and that's about it. After that, the game's cutscenes range from 20-second exposition fests that feel cobbled together from voice lines intended for other moments, and bizarrely long cutscenes toward the end of the game that just play out firefights between non-playable characters with no dialogue, poor rigging and animation, and an indiscernible meaning to the overall narrative. Who are these people? Why are their deaths so dramatic? Was this just a way to pad the game's length and say we had cutscenes even though we didn't record any dialogue? Who knows? And who cares? So, about now, you might be saying, Jordan, it sounds rough around the edges, but it might have some redeeming qualities. To which I'd say, shit no! Look, killing Nazis is one of the oldest and most cherished pastimes in gaming. It's very hard to get it wrong. See, here's how easy it is. And yet, somehow, over a decade after that first fateful first-person Nazi frag, Hour of Victory screws up America's favorite pastime so spectacularly with its blend of inept gunplay, poor AI, and slapshot encounter design. Okay, let's start with the gunplay. The first thing I noticed is that Hour of Victory apparently gives your characters beer goggles, judging by the intense slathering of motion blur. This isn't necessarily uncommon for shooters of the era, but coupled with sluggish controls and an inconsistent frame rate, it makes for a nauseating experience. You have an annoying button configuration that blends Halo and Call of Duty, putting B as crouch, but the left trigger is grenades and the sticks is running and aiming down sights. It works mostly fine for navigating the environments, but the ADS sucks, and it doesn't seem like there's actually much of a difference between using it and firing from the hip. The guns are what I can only describe as fantastically unremarkable, a paint-by-numbers assembly of rifles and automatic weapons that have been done better elsewhere. The feedback is adequate at best, the weapon sounds skip constantly depending on how the frame rate is feeling, and the detailing on the weapons leaves so much to be desired I often wondered if the models had finished loading in. Add to this a paltry selection that doesn't even include World War II mainstays like a bar or a shotgun, and what the hell is a game about shooting Nazis without a shotgun? What are we even doing here? But I mean, so what? Turning Point had lackluster shooting, right? Well yeah, but Turning Point also wasn't a chore to deal with in every other aspect like Hour of Victory is. The AI in Hour of Victory is so dumbass stupid, it's like watching an entire Nazi army recruited entirely from a 4chan board. See, because the game technically has a stealth option, there are different states of alertness that the AI can go between. But since stealth is limited to one character, and due to an abundance of ammo, easy to kill enemies, and extremely linear level design, you won't ever really use stealth, aside from one forced specific section, there's really no reason for the enemies to ever act unalert. But does that stop these dumbasses? Damn no. During my 3 to 4 hour tour of duty, I witnessed the enemy AI stop shooting at me mere feet in front of my face and go back to an unalert state. This, along with enemies colliding with the cover geometry and either glitching through or on top of random objects, is a common occurrence throughout. On occasion, enemies may dodge incoming fire or competently take cover, but for the most part, the channers seen here will just walk out and maybe or maybe not attack you. Here's a drinking game that's more fun than Hour of Victory. Every time an enemy attacking you deactivates and goes back to unalert, take a shot. It's more fun because you'll die of alcohol poisoning after the first few levels and won't have to play Hour of Victory anymore. So the AI is terrible and folds under pressure just like you'd expect from internet Nazis. But I feel like the designers knew that, because as the game goes on, it gets much harder. And by harder, I mean worse. In a last-ditch effort to evoke some kind of challenge, Hour of Victory throws legions of enemies at you at a time. It's not fun, and remains the mark of a shooter which has run out of ideas. Which makes this the perfect time to mention the game's shit-awful checkpoint system. Most levels, which are only between 7 and 15 minutes long to begin with, don't have any checkpoints, meaning that if you fight through, for example, unnecessarily large enemy waves and die, you have to start all the way back from the beginning. Some levels do have checkpoints, but they're a small mercy and won't save you from the most frustrating bits of the game that could have actually benefited from more checkpoints. Case in point, the tank level. The tank level in Hour of Victory is one of the worst vehicle sections I have ever encountered. The tank itself controls like a bathtub on an ocean of maple syrup if you can only paddle with a pool noodle. The turning is sluggish, and to add insult to injury, the areas you traverse are so small you can never really dodge any incoming rockets. So naturally, there are rocket launcher enemies everywhere, pelting you from afar as you try to discern where they are and retaliate. But that's not all. Because all of that would be too easy, the tank just stops working sometimes if you hit the level geometry wrong. Like you will nudge a tree and suddenly you can't put the tank in reverse and can't really move forward, so you just wiggle around hoping for a miracle. And if you're really unlucky, you'll be sitting in the open taking damage while this happens. The real cherry on this shit salad, though, is that the tank doesn't regenerate health, and there are no checkpoints. Even on the easiest difficulty, the ridiculously high damage, poor controls, and coupled with straight up busted geometry, turn what should technically be like a 5-minute level into a 15-minute plus trudge, provided you even make it to the end and don't have to start from the beginning. And your reward is that you get to play more Hour of Victory. Yay! Add to all this a litany of other problems, like the game having the draw distance of an N64 game suffering a panic attack, a poor objective indicator that will get you lost in multi-level areas, a regenerating health system that literally only works when standing still, and there's literally no reason you should play this game. Even basic tenets of FPS design, the things you don't even think about because they're just there and you always expect them, are betrayed. For example, guns don't reload automatically when a clip is empty. You have to hit the trigger again to force the game to reload. This sounds like a really small detail, until you're in the middle of a firefight expecting to reload like in any other FPS ever, and you don't know why you're taking damage but not dealing any. Hour of Victory is an encyclopedia of poor first-person shooter design choices. I don't know if it deserves to be studied or to have every copy confiscated and burned. It's honestly hard to admit a game is worse than Soldier of Fortune, but at least that game had satisfying gunplay and gore. Hour of Victory has nothing. Even if it worked as intended, it would have only ever been a middling addition to a pantheon of overly similar FPS titles. But not only is it overly familiar, it's broken or lacking in every respect. I don't remember the last time I had such a small amount of fun with a game. I give it credit by saying its brevity is a blessing, but even at roughly 3 to 4 hours, it's 3 to 4 hours you should consider spending on literally anything else. In summary, if our grandparents knew that winning World War II would result in a game this bad, I think they would have surrendered on the spot. Alrighty, Thank you everybody for watching. That ends it for today. We are up to 9 entries now on the list, and I am so glad that this series has already seemingly found an audience of people who are willing to engage with it and want to see what happens next. I may or may not be doing another episode next month, depending on how long it takes me to get through creating the Fear 3 documentary from scratch, but I for sure am planning at least 2 episodes for October that will be entirely themed around games with horror themes, which I'm both looking forward to and not, because I have some real bad games lined up, so it's kind of a, you win some, you lose some. But if you would like to help support me on this endeavor, including helping me get better equipment for recording, including I kind of need a new capture card. The one I have freaks out about every 20 minutes, and I have to unplug it and plug it back in. It's a real hassle, and it kind of prevents me from streaming right now. But if you would like to help out with any of that, please consider giving a little bit to my Patreon to be listed as a Patreon producer here. And also, be sure to throw a couple bucks to my Ko-Fi if you enjoyed this video today. As always, please like, subscribe, leave a comment down below. It all helps with the algorithm, and share this video wherever you think applicable. Like I said, I need all the help I can get right now. I'd really like to turn this into a full-time job. I'd really like to work on more content. I have so many more ideas for series, documentaries, video essays that I'd love to tackle, but I need the financial incentive to be able to do that. So any help is absolutely appreciated. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.